Our apologies for starting a little late. Our council meeting ended a little late. And this is the Homeless and Poverty Committee. I'm Jose Huizar, the co-chair. I've been joined by another co-chair, Marquis Harris-Dawson. Also, council member Mike Bonin and Curran Price is here. And if we could get started on item number 1, please. The clerk could read that into the record. Thank you.
Item number 1 is the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department, Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority, and City Administrative Officer to report relative to the inventory of housing for the homeless population and homeless housing strategies.
Thank you. And we are a little bit behind our agenda. Welcome, Councilmember Cedillo. We are a little bit behind in our agenda for this committee. We originally had a 6-month agenda, but because of the amendments to 56.11 that were given to us by council, we took those up initially, but now we are getting into what will be taking up different topics that relate to homeless and homelessness services at each meeting, and then hopefully within 5 months or so, we'll have a strategic plan that the CAO, CLA, and our council offices are working on. And today is an opportunity for us to discuss housing issues and as they relate to homelessness and what we can do to come up with some recommendations on this front, but also it's an opportunity for us to get to know what the situation is in terms of housing for our homeless. So we have a number of people here who will speak to us about that, and we'll open it up and leave it up to the panel. So thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Miguel Santana, CAO. I'm only here to give some introductory comments, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman. As part of your committee, you had made a decision to take on various topics every month with the goal of having a comprehensive policy through the end of this process. Today, the issue of housing will be the main topic that will be discussed. I'm joined by our colleagues at LASA in housing and a few other departments who have a PowerPoint presentation to go over sort of a housing 101, if you will. The idea is that following this presentation, whatever questions you have, you can certainly ask, and whatever further direction you want to provide, we would work with these departments, the CLA, to submit a report that would be presented at the next meeting of your committee on the issues of housing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Housing to walk you through the PowerPoint.
Good afternoon. I'm Helmi Hisserig, Assistant General Manager with Housing and Community Investment Department. And I have before you a very brief presentation from the perspective of the Housing and Community Investment Department Permanent Supportive Housing Supply. And I thought I'd begin by explaining how we set targets for permanent supportive housing. On the first page of the presentation, what you have is estimated need for affordable housing in the city of Los Angeles based upon the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. That's done every 7 years. It's part of the housing element in the city's planning department. And what you can see is that approximately 12.5% of the new housing needs in the city of Los Angeles are estimated for households earning below 0 and 30% of the area median, which is really the extremely low income and where the homeless community falls. Another 12.5% is for very low income households. This is estimated need for new housing. And about 15% of housing needs are for households earning between 51 and 81%. If you move to the right of the chart, what you'll see is annually the need for households, the need for new housing in Los Angeles is approximately 5,000 units for households earning below 80% of the median. That would be for households of 4 persons earning below 47,000. If you look at just the numbers for below 30% of AMI, the annual need, estimated need that's in our housing plan, our housing element, is about 1,500 units for households that are earning at or below 30% of the area median, or households of 4 people that are earning at or below $17,000 a year. So in terms of need, we have about 1,500 units estimated at 30% of AMI, and we are currently projecting production at about 300 units a year. The next page, here, I'll move the slide forward here, somehow. Okay, I turned it off. Sorry. Okay. There are a few other ways that we estimate need for homeless housing, and I put two ways that we estimate need on this chart. First of all, just looking at the homeless count, how many people are homeless in the city of Los Angeles. It's about 25,000 people in the last count that are homeless in the city of Los Angeles, and I believe about 17,000 were unsheltered. So if we just wanted to say we urgently needed to house everybody who was homeless, we'd need 25,000 or 17,000 units at a minimum. Another way we estimate the need for homeless has been done by the United Way Home for Good plan. They've been taking a look at what would it take to end homelessness for specific subsets of the homeless population. So if we were able to end homelessness for veterans by 2015, I think they've extended it out to 2016, we'd need to have about 1,167 units for veterans now in this next year. Similarly, if we were to end chronic homelessness by 2016, and again, I think they extended the deadline to 2017, we would need 4,618 units for chronically homeless individuals immediately now. The supply of housing is in various forms, so the housing department only does one type, but there are other departments within the city and the county that are doing different types of housing. So I've roughly estimated for you what the supply is in 2015. LASA, and Peter Lynn, who's to my left, can speak more specifically to it, they provide shelter beds for approximately 2,300 people in the city of LA. About 2,600 units of rental subsidies, so tenant subsidies, which is where an individual gets a voucher, either a Section 8 voucher or a VASH, Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing voucher, or a supportive housing voucher from the Department of Health Services. Those are tenant vouchers. Those are provided by HACLA primarily, and the Department of Health Services. Those are not new construction of housing. You're basically taking a voucher and occupying an empty unit. And then lastly is the permanent supportive housing supply, which is new construction of permanent supportive housing. And HSID is primarily involved in that, and we are currently producing approximately 300 units of permanent supportive housing per year. One thing I'll say about permanent supportive housing is the housing that is what we call permanent supportive housing is a service-enriched housing that lasts for 55 years. So when we are building a new unit, it is typically owned by a nonprofit, it is enriched with services, and it is has evidence-based analysis shown that it is the best type of housing for folks that are struggling with mental illness and substance abuse and difficulty staying housed permanently. So one of the goals that we have and we share with the other agencies is targeting the permanent supportive housing supply towards those that are chronically homeless or in the greatest need of a wraparound service model. Currently in the Housing and Community Investment Department, we have, I'm going to go to the next slide, excuse me. We have 11 projects that are in the financing pipeline today.
Yeah, and Sorry, before you go on,
Uh-huh.
so in terms of the actual number, okay, I'm looking at the other slides, we're getting there, thanks.
Okay. All right. So what I have is I have the information about what we have today, and then I'll also talk about what we've done over the course of the last several years. What we have today is, and this particular slide is intended to help you break down the money and how it works in permanent housing. So we have 11 projects. There's a total of 610 units, and of those, 491 of them are what we would call a permanent supportive housing. We do have projects that are mixed populations that have some supportive housing in them, and we have some projects that are 100% permanent supportive housing. So of those 11 projects, what you can see is that the contributions to the projects in terms of capital, primarily 66% of the contribution is coming from the low-income housing tax credit. So we are competing within the state. These projects compete at the state level for typically for tax credits that are in the state homeless set-aside. So they're competing, they've got to be competitive. And they are competitive when we can show the city's commitment to them. Currently, there's $132 million of low-income housing tax credits commitments in those 11 projects. There's also a commitment from the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We currently have $40 million committed to those 11 projects, and that has helped these projects score well at the state. And they also leverage other sources. It could be sources of debt from the state. It could be sources of debt from the private market. But there's about $28 million in those 11 projects. So in the current pipeline, what you have is, the large share of the capital is the equity in the tax credits, and the rest is soft and hard debt made up by public agencies like like HCID, as well as other state, county, and private lenders. We also have in every permanent supportive housing project operating subsidies, and so we've linked very closely to the Housing Authority, and they provide vouchers, operating subsidies to these projects. So the operating subsidies are not as high as they would be for a Section 8 in a fair market value context, because the operating subsidy is set down to the rent. That is what we charge. Well, so if we set the rent at a certain AMI level, there will be what we call a HUD rent, and so the operating subsidy supports up to the HUD rent. But our partnership with HACLA on the project-based vouchers has been vitally important. We've been sizing our commitments to the available vouchers, and we tie our selection of projects together so that we're working closely. There's a third leg to the stool. They call it a three-legged stool for permanent supportive housing, which I didn't show here, is all of these projects also have service funding commitments. So when we are selecting the projects, we're selecting developments that have service funding and service plans. And we've been working closely with the Department of Health Services at the county, the Department of Mental Health, and with both HACLA and LASA in identifying the projects that have the best service components. So the projects that are permanent supportive housing are capital, project-based vouchers, and service funding. I should add, some of the vouchers are VASH, Veterans Affairs, and so a portion of these are also targeted to veterans. In terms of, so going on to the next slide, if I can. So this is just a quick snapshot on the current sources of available capital. And I should say these capital sources kind of fluctuate. In terms of low-income housing tax credits, we are generally competing and getting about $130 million a year in credit for our projects. So we've been very, very successful at the state in terms of our are helping our projects that are in the pipeline to compete for set-aside dollars. If for some reason we don't hit a 300-unit threshold in terms of the set-aside competition, we have committed to 300 units, and so we find other tax credits, such as the city's geographic apportionment, or we add home dollars and use a different model. So basically, we've committed to 300 units, whether they win at the state or not. We have about $27 million in home funding. This is just a rapidly dwindling source of funds. Home is our federal entitlement for housing. It is now less than 50% of what it was 5 years ago. We are hearing federally there's a current budget, THUD budget, to reduce this by 94%, so we'd be down to under $2 million for the city. So we maximize our use of the home funds, and we have we commit any loan proceeds from older loans back into the trust fund, so that also is part of the $27 million. At the state, there's Prop 41, which was the allocation of resources towards primarily veterans homeless, and we've been achieving about $30 million of Prop 41 in the city of Los Angeles. That's been our target and what we're looking for from them. When we get the projects, to the extent we can get projects using that state fund, we can use 4% tax credits, which is the less competitive or less oversubscribed source of credits. There's also affordable housing, sustainable communities. We sometimes call this cap and trade. So those dollars are not specifically targeted to homeless. However, a number of our permanent supportive housing projects are going after cap and trade funds. So if they're located near transit, they can go after those funds, and that helps. In terms of operating subsidies, again, this is our partnership with HACLA, and they've committed to working with us at a level of about 300 project-based vouchers a year, and they've been putting additional project-based vouchers into projects that they are working on. And in terms of services fundings, it's pretty much unique project by project, how those services are funded and what's in the project. I don't have a slide for this, but the last chart in your handout just shows what we've done since 2006. We have completed 34 projects serving the homeless and have approximately 2,200 units. And you can see the breakdown. About 1,500, a little over that, are for homeless units. 81 are for veterans. That's been a newer effort. And about 704 units are for chronically homeless, so permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless. And we've been ramping that up considerably. The commitment of 300 per year is a new commitment that we put into the pipeline the last time we amended the regs. And then just to close, there's a number of different things that we're doing in addition to the funding of permanent supportive housing that are part of a interagency-wide effort to improve our housing for homeless. We have been working on our asset management side to identify turnover units and make them available for homeless. We've been working as part of the coordinated entry system to enable, to better target the high service-enriched units to those individuals that have the greatest need to get off, to get off the streets. We've been working with a number of developers have come to us. We've had over 17 requests for repositioning the old SRO units, primarily in the Skid Row area. So we've been working through our asset management to refinance those projects and enable them to be more financially viable over the long term. And we've been working on the development of a supportive housing policy for services, which enables the projects previously would have, I believe it was permanent supportive had a service. You could take an operating cost for services at about $800 per unit per year. we came to council a couple years ago and requested $3,000 per unit per year, and that is sized so that there is a full-time service coordinator for every 15 homeless individuals within the housing. And that is something we've continued to work with the developer community on, how to make that funding available. So what we're doing is essentially taking less money back as a loan repayment and letting the developer community that's serving the homeless take it in service coordination dollars. So we've been actively working on that policy, and we've actually reached out to both the state and the county providers, lenders, and the state followed suit on their Prop 41, and we've been working on that policy together with those other lenders. That is really it from the housing development perspective. All I'd say is that I think we're moving together with all the departments, HACLA, LASA, DMH, DHS, and even with the other community development financial institutions, the CAO, and of course all of you, but we've been working closely to improve homeless housing by improving many aspects of it, funding being one of them.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Peter Lynn, Executive Director for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. Can I get the clicker?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm told, there you go. So we were asked to do a couple of different things. One is to report on just sort of a primer on what the various kinds of shelter and housing types that, and provide some definitional aspects of these categories of shelter and housing and what they mean, so that we can have a sort of a standard glossary of terms. The second is to talk through the inventory for the city and also the Los Angeles Continuum of Care. We want to talk through our primary infrastructure model, which is the coordinated entry system, and their primary strategy for housing, which is housing first, and then essentially address any questions. So talking through, there is a significant difference between shelter models and housing models. And transitional housing is not a housing model, even though the term is in there. So it falls under the shelter aspect of this. In our continuum, there's essentially a year-round program for emergency shelter, which is operated by LASA. There are a number of additional shelter facilities that are operated by private organizations, including organizations like the Missions, and there are also a number of different emergency interventions, like vouchers for people to get them off the street in a given night, to put them in a motel. This is somebody who's in an immediate state of crisis. The primary infrastructure that we have is our year-round program. We add a number of beds to that program during the winter months when the inclement weather and the cold cause a great deal of suffering. And the last aspect of emergency shelter that I want to talk through is a shift that we've begun to make in the infrastructure that we have, which is to take shelter beds and focus them on populations that are being moved through our continuum resources into a permanent housing outcome. So the shelter infrastructure is a first-come, first-serve infrastructure. People show up, they queue up at bus locations to get into those units every night, and they have to repeat that process on a continuous basis. Generally speaking, a shelter infrastructure is designed to meet a person's needs in crisis and to rapidly move them into a permanent housing outcome, whether that's through a diversion strategy to get them repatriated to family, whether it's through a prevention strategy to help them meet an immediate crisis, whether it's a rapid rehousing strategy to get them temporary assistance that puts them into the rental market that they can be self-sustaining, or whether it's through a permanent outcome like permanent supportive housing or a low-service affordable housing unit, like, for example, a Section 8 voucher. The way our crisis system is working right now, it is crowded with people who are long-term stayers. So our shelter system has people who have been there for many years, essentially become a de facto housing resource, which is not the way this kind of shelter is supposed to be intended. Transitional housing is an older model that was intended to be an interim between placing people into permanent housing, because the idea was that people were not ready to be housed right off of the street. I say it's an older model because HUD has been very, very clear over the last decade and very intentional in the way that they're noticing continua across the country and in their funding notices and the way they're restructuring grants, that they are moving away from this model and they are defunding transitional housing as a model. The hallmarks of transitional housing are it's not a permanent housing outcome, so the placement into a temporary structured facility for up to 24 months with the intent of moving them out of that at some point into a permanent housing model. They retain their homeless status, so they are still homeless in that category, and they're counted in our, when we report to HUD, they are a homeless sheltered family or household. And but they lose their chronic homeless definition, so it is, they're no longer eligible for many of our permanent supportive housing resources. People can be terminated from those programs for program violations as opposed to lease violations. It's a big change from a housing first model where the intent is to maintain people in their housing. And again, the feds are targeting these programs for shift to evidence-based practices that have better outcomes, rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. Rapid rehousing is the sort of shortest term permanent housing assistance grant. And we use this on the Family Solution System. So we use this effectively with state and county DPSS TANF monies, and we also use emergency solution grant funding from the city and the county to place homeless families into rapid rehousing. It's a time-limited assistance. We provide move-in assistance, usually first month's rent, and then we taper the assistance down and put the family onto their own financial resources as rapidly as possible. Sometimes those go 6 months, sometimes longer. They do receive supportive services, they receive case management services. Again, those typically taper off. There may be some long-term connections with those families. It is in the housing market, so there's a housing identification and navigation process, and it takes advantage of the rental stock that we have. And there are no preconditions for participation in that. Obviously, one key element to it is that the family have the long-term financial capacity to cover the rent that they're being moved into. Permanent supportive housing is the most effective intervention for high acuity and chronically homeless individuals and families, as Helmi indicated. It is a permanent housing for as long as is necessary, permanent meaning there is no time limit. They can stay as long as that's necessary. In our continuum, we have used moving on programs to very effectively transition people out of those permanent supportive housing models who no longer need the supportive services into the housing market using Section 8 vouchers and other means so that we free up those units. But the permanent supportive housing model is that that unit is a home for them as long as they need it. The wraparound supportive services are customized to their needs and they cover whatever is necessary. It's essentially a whatever it takes as long as it takes kind of model. Participants pay 30% of their income for rent. This is consistent with the Section 8 vouchers. Shelter Plus Care is a similar sort of program. Our supportive housing program is very similar to that. Similar levels in the MHSA and other programs that are consistent with that. And then we do try to facilitate people who have stabilized their lives. They're in recovery. They've many people regain employment. There are other folks who have the capacity to move on and leave that supportive environment to move on and vacate that unit for somebody who is in a state of high acuity. So that's an effort to create attrition and turnover. Affordable housing is another option for folks who don't need the depth of supportive services, but they're not good candidates for rapid rehousing. So these would be projects that Helmi indicated in her portfolio that were targeted to the homeless but not chronically homeless individuals. So some of our portfolio has been built on that basis. We have a portfolio of mod rehab SRO, other kinds of set-asides for Section 8, Section 202 for the elderly, and Section 811 for the disabled. Just to talk through, for an instant, the principles behind Housing First, which is the evidence-based practice that HUD is urging all continua to adopt as their housing strategy, which is that essentially everyone is housing ready. There are no disqualifying requirements. People need services to maintain their housing, and that's what the continuum's responsibility is, to just wrap their services around the people and get them into a housing unit that's appropriate to their service acuity as rapidly as possible. So permanent supportive housing for those who have high acuity and for folks with lesser acuities and more financial stability, rapid rehousing, and other kinds of permanent housing. The evidence indicates there's improved quality of life, health, mental health, and employment with housing. So all of those things follow from a housing placement first, rather than sort of placing into that. And again, the emphasis is on using the rental market and to provide safe and affordable housing for folks. I wanted to just talk through for a second our coordinated entry system, because it is the regional infrastructure that we're building out in collaboration with numerous partners on the public sector side and on the county and city, but also our federal partners at HUD, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and the VA, as well as innumerable local community-based organizations which are carrying on a lot of the work of this, as well as strategy collaborators like the United Way, Home for Good team. It basically focuses on outreach and engagement for people who are either on the streets or in our shelter systems. Using that connection, we get them to fill out or walk through an assessment tool that we have. And we adopted a tool that's nationally recognized. It's called the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, or VI-SPDAT, the sort of unfortunate acronym. But the SPDAT then gives a sort of a service acuity scoring for people. And the intent is to take that scoring and use it as a primary means of case conferencing on people experiencing homelessness to move the highest acuity folks first into housing. So it's a shift from a static waitlist model to a prioritization by service need model. The process assigns high acuity individuals a case manager who will assist with navigating them through a documentation and housing application process. It gets them informed of benefits counseling if they lack benefits to which they are entitled. It connects them to other services that they're entitled. So it's a system that can snap in any kind of service model, whether it's employment counseling, other kinds of infrastructure that we can add to this mix. It's not merely for housing, but housing is a key component. Housing providers, when they have a vacancy, they submit those vacancies to their coordinated entry system match person. Those are designated 8 of them out across the service planning areas. Those folks match those vacancies to the prioritized list of people who are in navigation. So the model pulls people all the way through. We have, as I said, taken some of our shelter inventory, focused it on high acuity people who are in that navigation process, because one of the challenges for a system like this is that as you navigate high acuity people, you can lose them on the street again. So we don't want to do that when people are matched. That's where our interim beds and use of the intentional shelter beds is very helpful. We then match them to the next highest priority, and that could be a shared housing environment if they've indicated that they're willing to accept that. It also does include our permanent supportive housing inventory and most of our other infrastructure. We have a system that works on the family side. It's very similar to this. The front end is usually a 211 application, because those families will typically call. On the chronically homeless individuals, it's very unlikely that they will reach out through 211. Mostly those are outreach on the street or pulling people through our shelter infrastructure. One of the responsibilities that LAHSA has is reporting to HUD, both on our homeless count and point in time, number of persons out on the street and in our shelters, as well as counting our housing inventory. So I wanted to walk through the inventory model that we have. So the continuum of care is Los Angeles County less the cities of Long Beach, Glendale, and Pasadena. They have their own continuum of care, so it's the city and the county less those other cities. Our inventory for shelter beds is 15,000 units roughly across the entire continuum. That is predominantly shelter capacity with about a little less than half of it being transitional housing capacity. On the city, the total is close to 10,000. Again, it's heavy on transitional housing within the city infrastructure. Some of that includes programs that are not, much of it is not funded by the by LASA, but our responsibility is for counting all of the programs that are out there. So this would include transitional programs like the Veterans Affairs Grant Per Diem program, so structured programs through other federal assistance. Those that are funded through LASA are include transitional housing programs that constitute an older inventory from the HUD grants that were passed in previous years. That is an infrastructure we need to take a strong look at and right-sized based on the guidance that we get from HUD and the need to look at those programs and reallocate funds where necessary. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the clicker here. On our the funds, those that are funded directly from LASA is less than half the inventory. So you can see there's a large inventory of units that is controlled by other parties than LASA. So that would include publicly funded, like those through our allies at the Department of Mental Health and Department of Health Services, which operate respite beds. It would include grant per diem programs and other things, but it would also include the infrastructure at, say, the missions and other nonprofits and community and faith-based organizations. Our portfolio that's organized through LASA is about 1,700 year-round shelter. We add about 1,400 beds during the winter shelter program, and there are about 2,200 transitional program units. The continuum funds close to 15,000 units of permanent housing, and that's broken down largely permanent supportive housing with some rapid rehousing through, as I said, the Homeless Family Solution System. Other permanent housing outcomes would be dedicated units through the project-based voucher portfolio that Helmi referenced, or set-aside programs. On the city controls most of that inventory. So the permanent supportive housing inventory, 10,000 of those units are within the city of Los Angeles. The available rapid rehousing is about 700 units. Now, again, that's a unit of assistance. Usually those turn over within about 6 months, so that's, that would be two individuals or households served, and those are predominantly family units. So it constitutes the inventory of what we look at and that's available to us. The match against the need is where there's considerable analysis going on right now, and I had hoped that I could present the results of that analysis to you, where our operations were a little disrupted by the fire that at our headquarters, which, in a not very amusing irony, displaced LASA from its lodgings. And so we do not have the results of that, but there is a really important effort right now that combines the strategic leadership from many different organizations to look at the portfolio we have, and using the best practice guidance from HUD, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and some of their technical assistance providers to evaluate what our portfolio needs to convert into to be right-sized to fit the challenge that we've got.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Dylan Lawrence with the CAO. The charts and figures you've just seen represent the most up-to-date research we have regarding the universe of beds, specifically designated for the homeless population across the city and a continuum of care. Just for context, the CAO worked in a very coordinated effort with LASA to collate these numbers and put them into something easily digestible. These facts and figures, they come in response to the adoption of recommendation 1F from a report that's been highly cited from our office, detailing the high cost of homelessness to the city. And that recommendation was to have our office pursue a policy on homelessness that considers measures against which progress can be monitored, including identifying data sources from all relevant stakeholders. So that's what we've done with LASA here. The information depicted here represents our fully coordinated effort as a way of giving a baseline for progress in the future. This office anticipates that the information presented here will provide some context for the policy the city develops to alleviate and end homelessness in the city of Los Angeles, and hopefully it will inform the choices LASA as well as the city makes in terms of distributing housing and beds in the future. if there are any questions, any further questions regarding those graphs or those tables, I'm available to answer them, or you can refer to Peter. Just wanted to give my piece, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. And what we'll do at this time is see if there's any questions from the committee, and then go into public comment, or we could go into public comment. However, we would. You guys rather? Let me take up. We have Kevin Murray from Chrysler, who was here to present. I think why don't we? You want to sit up here? Who wanted to present something as well, so we could.
Thank you for having me. I just wanted to add my comments to the concept here, some of which I agree with and some of which I disagree with. I am president and CEO of the Weingartz Center Association. We run a homeless housing operation on 6th and San Pedro in the heart of Skid Row. We house roughly 500 people a night in various different programs. We are have contracts with the LASA, with the county, with the state, with the federal government. We have vets, we have women. We have just about everything but permanent supportive housing, which God and the planning department willing, we will shortly be entering into that mode. There are a couple of things that I want to have this committee to do and pursue. And one is accept what I consider the fact that there is no one solution to the homeless problem. So we keep, in my years down here, we keep trying to go either student body left or student body right and try to find a single solution. Right now, it happens to be housing first. The fact is, housing first works great for a significant number of people, and you certainly reduce hospital visits and emergency room visits, but it isn't perfect for everyone. People come to homelessness, you know, the famous cliche, there's a million, you know, different stories in the naked city. People come to homelessness from various perspectives, and we should continue to be multimodal. Some of you know that when I was in the legislature, I chaired the Transportation Committee for many years. Our buzzword was always multimodal. You guys have debated this in various contexts. You need your bicycles, you need your cars, you need your planes, your trains, your buses. Same thing in homelessness. You need shelters, you need transitional housing, you need permanent supportive housing. But one model is not necessarily going to work. I think the other thing that the committee and the council, and by extension the city, need to do is decide what your goal is. Is your goal to house people, or is your goal to get people to self-sufficiency? Because in much of the debate, you don't really hear talk about life skills development, workforce development, things that actually get people to self-sufficiency. Mostly what we're all talking about, and I include myself in this, is getting someone into a home for which they're probably going to be subsidized for the duration. How do you break that cycle is one of the things that at least should enter the thought process. I know it's not the easiest way and it's not the most direct way, but I think that that ought to be part of our thought process. You know, we have a need of 20,000 units. We're building 300 permanent supportive housing units a year, so how do you jumpstart that? And is it even possible to scale that in a reasonable time frame to solve our problem? So I am suggesting that the committee and by extension the council broaden its horizons and thought process, and to the extent that you're asking more information of the CAO's office to look into these things, I would ask you to look into those things. You know, even with permanent supportive housing, it works great for a number of different people, and as I said, we are moving into that. But think about the idea that you're going to take someone who might have serious mental illness, you're going to put them in an apartment by themselves. And yes, they're going to have services, and yes, there's a case manager, but should we cross maybe the Rubicon of talking about more institutional type help? The other thing you ought to think about is, for instance, a homeless encampment and a homeless person on Skid Row is different than one in Venice, and different than one in Hollywood, and different than one in South Central, and different than one in other places. So we need to have a broader view of the different types of people and their situations and what could help them Again, repeating myself a little bit, we should talk more about life skills and job training and things that actually get people to self-sufficiency. One of the other things I want to mention is one of the great quivers one of the great arrows in the quiver of the city is the planning, is your planning department. And what can we do to encourage the additional housing, whether it's permanent supportive housing or transitional housing or whatever other kind of housing you think it is, to take a priority. One of the things this council should consider, and maybe this is a long shot, but do we want to consider our homeless crisis much like an earthquake or a flood or any other kind of emergency? Has it really gotten that bad? And I would argue, as many of you do, and as I know Mr. Weingartz does, if you drive down San Pedro, when you leave here today, you will come to the conclusion that homelessness is a crisis and maybe should get the kind of emergency intervention that we have gotten for other disasters. But if, for instance, you wanted to prioritize homeless housing or ultra-low-income housing and prioritize that in terms of process, should someone who is helping the city to meet a priority need of homeless housing have to wait behind someone who's trying to raise their fence from 6 feet to 8 feet in the housing process? There's been a lot of talk about dispersion around the city, and I think that that's a good goal, but many parts of our city, as you know, are mature. So could you prioritize or make it easier for people to avoid the NIMBYism, to build some of these projects in industrial zones on a limited basis, as opposed to a currently residential area where you're liable to get more negative feedback? So, in conclusion, my main goal is to ask the committee to broaden its horizons and its thinking about what the individual solutions might be, and urge you to adopt multiple tacks. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate those comments. And what we will do right now is go to a brief discussion from the committee members and then go to public comment. We're going to do public comment both on item number 1 and general public comment as well. Some people signed up for public comment in general, so we want to entertain those as well. Let me turn over first to Mr. Cedillo. You indicated you want to start off. Sure, go ahead, Mr. Cedillo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I think the first thing is to figure out what's the nature of the problem. And so this has been helpful, particularly when we talk about some of the numbers that lay out what we have, which everybody's done a great job at, but also what we need, right? So when we look at, where was that chart that told us, we had a need of some great number, and then we're doing 300 a year. Just on the front page. You have estimated needs, right, for this 6-year period, and we have an annual need. So low income, we have a need of 1563, but we're producing 300 a year. The next one, 1563, the next one. So there's a need for 5,000 units there, and we're producing 1,000, right? So the question is, how do we get from 1,000 to 5,000, right? That's the question that we have. And then it also raises the same questions for affordability, right? And so that's one question, is to figure out what's the problem. And so there's a gap there. There's like 4,000, there's like an 80% gap, right? So we've got 20% of the housing projected, but we don't have a strategy for the other 80%. And so that's one question. The other question, and Senator, I'm glad that you're here, is there's a question, or one of the challenges we have is duty. Whose duty? So we're having a conversation here at the City of Los Angeles, but we don't do social services. And so then the question is, whose duty is it to do these wraparound services and all these other things that you did, or that you mentioned, but we don't have we don't have the full duty on this. We've got partners, right? We've got the nonprofit world, we've got the county world, we've got the Fed world, and so we have to figure out whose duty so that we can figure out what is the piece that we can do. And then finally, I think for us, we have to figure out, I really like this thought, you know, how can we get into like a crisis thought process, right? Now, you're right, if you go down San Pedro, yeah, of course we're in crisis. But it's not just San Pedro, though. I mean, if you go to 6th and, if you go to Beaudry and 6th Street, if you go down the Arroyo Seco corridor, if you, Councilmember Weezer and I share that corridor. If you go up and down that corridor, there's a crisis. If Mr. Bonin will tell us that there's definitely a crisis in Venice. And so the question is, how do we move into a crisis mentality? Because I've seen us operate in that way, in which we make the right priorities and then we rise to the challenge. And so we had an earthquake here in 1992, and this community was amazing in how we rallied together and went past city, county, state, federal barriers, and everybody worked together, and we built freeways and reopened them and moved people and did a lot of things really rapidly. And the question is, how do we move into a mindset of crisis so that we can then make some great leap forward? So I offer that to you guys to start this conversation.
If you want to respond, I think that you're absolutely correct. And part of it, if you look at the people next to me, they all have a limited sort of list of tools that they can use. And there needs to be more coordination between the various government entities that are involved in this. And I think the social services part is an important one, because I think it's been said before, you're not going to house your way necessarily out of this process, even though that's a core part of what you're doing. But people are on the streets sometimes because of significant issues, not just misfortune. That we've gotten beyond the somebody just down on their luck concept.
Right.
So the social services that you point to are important. And if you provide the housing without making sure that the social services are happening, no matter which government entity provides them, I think you end up with a problem. Someone who was doing bad things on the street, and not to demonize them and certainly not to criminalize them, just don't stop doing those things because you gave them a roof and somebody kind of monitors them. You know, do they become a good neighbor? Do they become a good tenant without some other type of help? And so I would argue that not everyone is housing ready in the sense of being a good tenant and a good neighbor, and those social services are going to be important.
Thank you. Helmi, do you want to respond to that as well?
Both of us would like to comment. I would like to make a quick comment about the nature of this as an emergency. The difference between homelessness as an earthquake is that homelessness is not a new problem and it doesn't happen once. You know, we've been having this problem in the city of Los Angeles for decades. So an emergency response, I think it's a great idea to take it seriously in the way that we would respond to an earthquake or some type of emergency. But I actually think that we have to, at the same time, not respond with only tools to solve a one-time problem. And we definitely need to have, I would like to see a longitudinal study of why we continue to have an increasing supply of homeless people in the city of Los Angeles. What are the structural problems in housing that are causing this over time? And one of the things about permanent supportive housing, it is only for a small subset of the homeless population. But one of the things that I think that is very good about it with the coordinated entry is we are actually now starting to talk about, you described it as an institutional model of housing. We're talking about how many units. One question that is out there is, How many units of permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles do we need to serve a housing population that has a very hard time staying housed for a variety of reasons? And at what is that right number? I don't think we have answered that question yet. I think we're getting there. We're estimating annual need, but I don't think we really have a target. I know from the Housing and Community Investment Department, I feel like we don't know what number is the right number for that inventory. So we're just producing right now as maximum based on the available sources, but not with a goal in terms of how many units we need.
Just for the record, by institutional housing, I meant mental institution,
Yeah.
not
got it.
institution like how many permanent supportive housing institutions we need.
So let me, if I could ask a question to help me on that. You focused on permanent supportive housing, and as I was listening to the presentations, I agreed. It's hard to really say what's the need for permanent supportive housing. But for emergency and transitional shelters, in that category, we know we have 25,000 people more or less who are on the street in the city of LA. And how many units of emergency, transitional, and housing do we have? We have
Like 10, you
In
said
the entire
10,000?
continuum,
No,
there's
in the-
probably about 12,000.
about
across the
12,000.
entire
Okay,
continuum.
and we could say that for permanent supportive housing, it's kind of hard to predict exactly how many units we need, but we could get a bit more concrete there, right? And we still know there's a huge gap there,
We
right?
actually can get very precise with those numbers.
We could get, and we're talking what, 10, 15,000?
It will be a very large number.
Yeah, okay. And I'm just trying to, we covered permanent supportive housing, which is hard to say how many exactly do we need, but on the shelters, however broadly defined, it's a bit more,
Well-
we could get more precise, right?
No, I actually was speaking to the permanent supportive housing side. On the shelter side, it's a lot less clear because the inventory depends on how many people we're not housing. We should be housing people. Shelters shelter people, and they're in a state of homelessness. We need some shelter, definitely. We need to be housing people at a much faster clip than we are. And the permanent supportive housing inventory that we're going to need, we will have very precise information about that based on the information through the coordinated entry system. So one of the things that the coordinated entry system gathers is extremely precise assessments of thousands of people experiencing homelessness. We can tell very, very clearly what their needs are, and we can place them, connect them to the housing resources that we have, and it will definitely indicate to us where the gaps are. Permanent supportive housing is extremely successful even for people who are really tough, and no one is suggesting putting people with high service needs into a unit and leaving them be. But we have people using the rental market, using our Shelter Plus Care portfolio or Section 8 vouchers, who have extremely challenging needs, and the supportive housing portfolio that includes tenant-based does not have a higher or worse attrition rate than the project-based permanent supportive housing. It is a successful model to place people into the rental market using a permanent supportive housing model with wraparound services. That is a very effective technique, and we use that thousands of times in this continuum. We do need a portfolio of shelter. We definitely need more housing. The key to getting people off the streets is to get them housed.
Okay, Mr. Bonin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Cedillo, for stressing the need to act as if this were an emergency, because it is. When this committee met for the first time when it was still an ad hoc in June, about 90 days ago, at least 3 of the members of the committee talked about how we need to declare a state of emergency. And 3 months later, we're still talking about how we need to declare a state of emergency. I think we actually need to actually legitimately declare a state of emergency in many of the ways that Mr. Murray was talking about. And Mr. Cedillo, if you'd like to join me, I'd like to have our staffs work on a motion that addresses that. And I think there's a number of things that we should be doing. One, as Mr. Murray suggested, we should be making it a policy that if it's an affordable housing project, it should go to the front of the line at the planning department. We should be making it a policy to make it easier to cite homeless programs. Every winter when we do the emergency winter shelter program, we actually declare a state of emergency that says that these shelters at these armories can open. We should be doing that. Allow churches and synagogues, service providers to open smaller shelters without going through an incredible zone change or a variance process or a CUP. It is that kind of state of emergency. So I'd be happy to join with Mr. Cedillo in preparing something like that. I wanted to thank Senator Murray for what you said in particular, because I've been trying to say the same thing in various forums over the past couple months. The gap between our supply and our demand is enormous and is getting larger. The numbers that Helmy showed about our need, I actually think it's much greater than that, because I anticipate that those need figures don't anticipate units lost to short-term rentals, to covenants expiring, to the rapid cost of rental housing going up around the city. So it's actually much more severe than that. Housing First absolutely works, but it's, as Mr. Murray said, it's not the only thing that works. When I was an undergraduate, I took a comparative religion course, and one of the essays they had us read was by Gandhi, and it said all religions are true. Now, I don't know if all responses to homelessness are true, but a lot of them are, and a lot of them are effective. And when I see, that the federal government is discouraging transitional housing, and that the gap between the number of unsheltered people we have and the number of available sheltered beds is so great, I kind of feel like our approach has been that telling someone who needs a triple bypass that in the meantime they shouldn't be watching their diet or taking their heart medicine. And there are so many folks who aren't going to get the triple bypass, the permanent supportive housing, in the next 6 months or a year, and we need to be giving them the heart medicine, the transitional housing, or we need to be giving them the restricted diet, which is different types of shelters. And at our first committee meeting, again, back when we were an ad hoc, we asked LASA and CAO to look at the full continuum of options. This isn't that, right? That's still a separate report we'll be getting? Okay. Because we definitely need to move from institutional jail-like shelters into maybe smaller, more targeted facilities. As I said before, the young folks who are living on Venice Beach don't want to go into a big warehouse facility. Folks who live on the streets and have dogs for protection can't get into a shelter with an animal. Mm-hmm. Couples get split up if they go into a shelter, and we're creating so many barriers to access that we need to address that. I wanted to ask about a couple different aspects of that. You touched, Peter, in your answer, in your talk, on shared housing very briefly in CES. I've seen in Venice a local organization called Share, which has been able to get folks off the street much more quickly than the traditional means, because it doesn't cost $300,000 per unit and stuff like that, into shared housing. To what extent is CES utilizing or plugging into a shared housing model as part of its continuum of options, of avenues for folks to go down?
So when a participant indicates that they're willing to accept shared housing, they are linked to providers who are working in those models. So one of the challenges in our continuum is that we don't have a tremendous amount of expertise in that area. So one thing that we need to do is grow the provider base of folks who can effectively put those kinds of arrangements together, and also think through the subsidy types that will assist them. So rapid rehousing typically doesn't target a shared housing outcome for folks, but it could. So it's a level of expertise and a growing the provider base who can essentially work in that kind of model. It's an effective model in some continua, and candidly, it is the low-income housing strategy in Los Angeles. People double up to the tunes of tens of thousands across our continuum, and that is how low-income folks stay in an extremely unaffordable housing market. When we think about the drivers into homelessness, the primary driver is the unaffordability. Our housing market is one of the worst in America, and study after study over the last couple of years have shown that. The gap between what people make and what they're asked to pay is extraordinary. The rent-burdened percentage of the households here is extraordinary. The number of households doubled up and overcrowded is extraordinary. So from a housing affordability perspective, it is in crisis. There's no question about that, and that is an enormous driver. It is very important that we make sure that people get connected to the mental and behavioral health services that they need. So whether they're housed or they're homeless, we need very tight, good access to mental health treatment and substance use treatment. And that's where our county partners play an extraordinarily effective role. And it's a broadening role because ACA makes Medi-Cal available to this entire population. It also provides for mental health and substance use payment options. And our newly approved, just this past month in August, drug Medi-Cal waiver will put a lot more substance use treatment resources into the hands of this population. So I feel like we have good payment models for that, and we have good partners on the county side. I do think that on the coordination side, I think that the level of coordination we've got right now is unprecedented. Can we improve it? Of course, but it is really tight right now, and there's a thoroughgoing county effort in parallel to what you guys are doing.
I would agree with Peter that in what we're doing now, our partners at the county are coordinating very well with LAHSA and us. We actually, through our Family Solutions Center, funded by LAHSA, we actually do put families in shared housing, and I think that it's a very interesting model and works well. What you need, however, in shared housing is you need a different kind of landlord, because they are now managing not only the building itself or the house or whatever it is, but they're managing within the building. So
if we need to be doing, just like Home for Good is doing, trying to encourage folks to provide units for veterans, if we need to be doing the same for shared housing, those are, I think, are recommendations that would be important for us.
Yeah, we've had a few landlords who actually feel the mission and wanting to do that, but it takes a little bit of extra work on them and on us to manage within a unit. Even a large unit, it does take some time, but it is a potential model, and I think Peter's absolutely right. In the sort of pre-crisis world, I'll call it, people would be doubling up. You'd be sharing. Yeah. You'd be getting a roommate. You'd be doing whatever you could to not be on the streets. And so I think shared housing is a potential solution, one of the potential solutions.
And Peter, you mentioned that the federal government has been effectively, I guess, either discouraging or sort of starving transitional housing programs.
That's correct.
To me, as much more of a layman than you or most of the folks in the room, that sounds concerning, because I know folks who've gotten lost between the sidewalks in Los Angeles, which is really our de facto housing policy, is sleep in a tent. People get lost between then and the permanent supportive housing. Do you agree that or disagree that it's a problem that transitional housing is being downplayed? And if so, what should we be doing as a city to sort of step up, or encourage the county to do to step up to fill the gap?
So the thinking is that people need housing, not transitional housing. So the idea is that those resources provide less effective outcomes at a greater cost. And that's the data demonstrate that, and that data in our continuum is consistent with the national data. The idea is that you take those monies and reallocate them to permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. It is a more effective model.
I get that. Permanent supportive housing is more effective than transitional housing. Transitional housing is more effective than an emergency shelter. An emergency shelter is more effective than a tent, and a tent is more effective than a sidewalk. But right now, the choice that most folks are faced with is the sidewalk. So given that I don't think under the rosiest and most optimistic of scenarios, we're going to have the permanent supportive housing supply to meet the need certainly in the term of office I'm in the next 2 years, shouldn't we be trying to provide a better option than what folks are currently experiencing?
If I might, Councilman, we, the Weingartz Center, have taken the brunt of that fact, which Peter is absolutely correct on. The federal government has decided to go student body left, and they are not funding transitional housing. So here's what's happened, down in our place. So they fund transitional housing programs. But then what happened was they couldn't find permanent supportive housing for the number of people they needed to find it for. So they've come back and they just don't call it transitional housing, they call it interim housing. Right. But granted, it's not mostly from the federal government. But here's what you lose by not having transitional housing and by having interim housing, which is a little shorter term, is there's no funding for life skills training. There's no funding for clinical groups when the person is in transitional housing. There's no funding for workforce development. There's no funding for resume building. So as you lose transitional housing, you're not just losing a 9-month, 12-month, 2-year housing resource because you're putting them in permanent supportive housing. You're losing all of these other things that were moving people not just to housing, but to potential self-sufficiency. The other thing that we've done is we have focused, again, student body left, on people with high acuity. And I think the coordinated entry system and United Way and lossless participation in that, I think, have done a great job in expanding outreach and trying to convince those people who are service resistant to getting into housing. But one of the definitions of chronically homeless is that you've been homeless for a certain period of time. By focusing all of your attention on those which are higher acuity, again, you save cost in lots of places, less emergency room visits, less police visits, less things. But by focusing all the money there, that person who could have been gotten off the streets and maybe made self-sufficient with a little bit of help, therefore becomes high acuity. So right. You're creating a permanent class there. And again, those people need help. The high acuity folks deserve help, but it's about having multiple attack points rather than focusing all in one area.
Last question real quickly. With El Nino coming this year, I've heard a lot of folks ask whether or not it would be wise for the city and the county to open the winter shelter programs early this year. If I were to bring in a motion on that later in the week, is that something that is a good thing we should be looking at or not?
We certainly need to. I mean, the El Nino season, that doesn't start on a date. It starts, but they're projecting it for November. Our winter shelter season starts in December. So, an additional month would probably bring a lot of people out of the rain.
All right, I'll introduce that motion on Friday.
Thank you. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment about different tactics and the question about whose responsibility. In the city of Los Angeles, almost all of our funding for homelessness is coming from HUD. So we are really linked to HUD as a strategy. The redevelopment agency used to put about $50 million in affordable housing, and the loss of redevelopment dollars was replaced at the state to some extent by cap and trade and Prop 41, but not to the levels that we used to have it. And so I would say that to achieve a multi-pronged strategy, we also have to have multi-prongs of sources of funding, because our funding, our funding is very our strategies do get certainly tied to the sources of funding that we have available. And the federal sources have a lot of strings attached that limit our ability to be flexible and creative.
Thank you.
We certainly do need to step up the funding and go after the entire population. I don't think, we are prioritizing people of high acuity. That doesn't mean that the other people experiencing homelessness don't also need housing. We need the resources to go and house them as well.
Thank you. What I'll do now is briefly go to some other questions from our committee members, and then go to public comment, and then we'll further continue the conversation, this discussion. My one question, though, is geographically, what is the distribution of the housing that we're providing, what exists now? And I'm certainly a proponent of decentralizing services and housing because it's a citywide problem. It's not just a Venice problem, a Hollywood problem, a Skid Row problem. It's really a city-wide problem. In your thinking, as we currently stand in providing the sites and the funding for creating more of these, whether they be shelters, permanent supportive housing, whatever it is, housing, have we been thinking about the decentralization question, or we just go as the opportunity comes right now?
On the permanent supportive housing side, we are very interested in housing throughout the city, and we've been very successful in having it dispersed broadly throughout the city of Los Angeles. I'm sorry I don't have the numbers with me, but over the last several years, we have decentralized and permanent supportive housing. I can't speak to the shelter and the other types of housing.
Well, certainly on the continuum of care funds that are going for permanent supportive housing, most of the new ones are going to tenant-based. So there isn't a site, facility model for those. They're distributed resources. They're essentially a rental subsidy, and they follow where the rental market is and where the person chooses to lease.
Jarvis Dawson?
Yes, I want to join with the other members of the committee that have talked about declaring a state of emergency. I think that's exactly the right way to go. And I think, different than an earthquake, the state of emergency that I remember the city declaring was very similar to homelessness. It had a bunch of causes, but it had one big impact, and that was the 1992 civil unrest. One of the things that got done in the civil unrest, which many of us ended up opposing, but it was a rational response to the conditions as we saw it. That was the city said, if you existed before the civil unrest and you went away, we need you to come back. So in order to facilitate that, we're going to take away all the processes that normally make that process really, really long. We're going to take away a lot of those hoops, and we're going to make it easy for you to come back. Given that this is a crisis of primarily a failed housing market for Southern California, a housing market that does not meet the needs of the people, what are some of the levers that we have as a city, as a city council, to help push the production of housing? Because you essentially gave us a chart that said in 5 years the problem is going to be exponentially worse. So it's almost like it's not quite like we're doing nothing, but we're planning for the crisis to get worse if we believe the numbers that you put forward. So how can we dramatically increase the production of housing in a short amount of time?
I think that the housing production, the housing supply could be achieved through both public investment as well as private sector strategies. And I think that it involves the planning department and taking action on the production of housing overall. I think the incentives that have been described that would push housing for lower income people to the head of the line, and if it's done in a market rate context, that's terrific. I think there's ways to incentivize that. I think that in addition to cash, any land we make available, if we build affordable housing or permanent supportive housing on public parking lots, for example, the cost of building the parking structure underneath and the paying for the land shouldn't be borne by the housing subsidy. We need to find another strategy to make land available. And I think there's multiple prongs to move housing faster, both within the department as well as within the private sector.
So should we put forward some language that declares an emergency? Could you, as a part of that for us, come up with a handful of recommendations that would achieve that?
I think the department would be very interested in doing that, yes. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, appreciate the thoughtful discussion on this topic that really touches everybody and impacts quality of life for all of us. I too want to join those in declaring the situation a real crisis. I think it's more than symbolism. I think it hopefully will be a call to action for us all. But appreciate all the comments, especially those of the senator who suggested that there is no one size that fits all, and I think we all realize that. Something I've been really focusing on recently, an issue that's been impactful in my district, are the families that are homeless now. Sometimes mothers and fathers with kids, in and out of cars or however they make it. More frequently, the single mom, the struggling mother with 2 or 3 kids in tow. So talk about how this subset is impacted with this rapid rehousing strategy that we're talking about. I know there's some discussion about sharing, but does this rapid rehousing strategy really impact families, homeless families that are kind of caught betwixt and between?
So it's a really good point. It is one of the gap. We have a significant gap in resources for our continuum for single adults, but we do have rapid rehousing resources for families, and we get those through TANF dollars. We get those through Emergency Solutions Grant dollars, and there's one other state source. But that is an extremely effective tool for families. Our housing market is getting more challenging, and so it's taking longer for families to lease. There are a few more barriers in that. But we put more than 1,000 families successfully into permanent housing last year using that model. And if we look at the attrition rate or the recidivism rate for the previous funding cycle, so 18 months back, the attrition rate for those, or the recidivism rate for those families, is 6.5%. So it's a very effective model for placing families back into rental assistance. We do need more funding for rental assistance for rapid rehousing, and we do need some focused permanent housing resources for families for whom that's not a good mix. Some of them need additional services, but it is an effective model for families.
Now, the discussion here was about the... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we actually, thanks to Peter and Lassa, run the Family Solutions Center, which I believe is in your district, 115th in Vermont.
Just outside.
Just outside. And it is it is one of our most successful models of going, and we do have a low recidivism rate. And it is actually getting better. There are more, as we talked about, landlords willing to do either shared housing or willing to do these housing. And what we have found is that because, and more to the earlier points, because we do come up with a budget and we subsidize the family for 6 months, and we have a significant plan for them to leave the nest, so to speak, and handle it on their own, we think it works very well, and that's one of the reasons there's A, low recidivism, and B, landlords are willing to take families that they might not otherwise take because they know that they have a case manager and they have support from us and from LASA. So I think the expansion of that model, and to Peter's point, additional funding of that model would also help very much.
So there is intense case management that goes
Absolutely.
along with that.
Absolutely. There's budgeting, there's case management, there's the standard sort of getting you to your appointments and getting the kids in school. But frankly, one of the most important things is the budgeting and the financial help and the essentially forced savings. Because a lot of these families have an income, just not enough income to maintain a household. And so to the extent that we give them some financial literacy also, it helps them going forward, and we do have pretty good success there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. What I'll do now is, anything pressing now, Mr. Cedillo, or I'll go ahead.
Helmy, you were asked to talk about the question of housing and how we can go forward. Get that networking done. On the question of the housing and what are the things we can do, we offered 6 proposals. We had a housing conference 2 weeks ago, and we offered 6 proposals. You might want to look at those within the framework of your report back. Let me suggest that. And 2, Mr. Murray, you had indicated, because this is a multimodal approach that we have to embrace. And there are moments where housing first is sufficient and moments when it's not. Like you, we spend a lot of time talking about mental health. We had a whole series of hearings, it's a long time ago, throughout the state. Can we hear on the report back about mental health and what the city could be doing, about emancipated youth, young people coming out of foster care, within 6 months they're on the streets. And so what are some of the things that we can do to capture that population so that we don't proliferate people at the front end and then put them on a cycle that's, we end up seeing them again for the next 20 years. So some of those areas would be helpful in terms of reporting back to us, because supply is one problem and we have to address it, but there are other component parts and we need to address them all. Mr. Weezer.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cedillo. So what I'll do now is I'll go to the public, and I'm going to call upon those who signed up for public comment on item 1, and also go through those who signed up for public comment on the general public comment. And as a reminder, what we're doing today is, today's topic is housing. We have a number of other agenda items coming to this committee with different topics the next few months, with the overall purpose and goal to develop a strategic plan for the city. I just want to put that as a framework again. So I'll call 3 people up at a time for efficiency's sake. Peggy, and this is an item number 1, general public comment as it relates to housing. Thank you. Peggy Lee Kennedy, Rachel Leon, and Ed Rosenthal.
On item 1, not on my, because I submitted a general public comment also.
You could also speak on that one when I call those right after I finish with item number 1. And everyone
Okay.
has 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Considering the numbers of 13,000 people falling into homelessness in Los Angeles County, it certainly is an emergency. But when you look at this multi-pronged approach, you need to look at your own city agencies and how they're handling the situation. You have city planning and building and safety doing things that will get rid of affordable housing much easier for the developer so they can make money. Why aren't we looking at that? We need to look at that. There's this state law called the Mello Act. And did you know that a developer can submit a statement saying that they won't get rich? It's not feasible for them to follow the state law. So, we need to look at all the internal issues. And also, we have a very rich city parking lots in Venice that we could build housing over. Huge amounts of it.
Thank you. Rachel Callion, not here? Yes, Rachel. And then Ed Rosenthal.
Hello, I'm Rachel Caloyne with SHARE. And SHARE is a self-help recovery exchange. We have permanent supportive housing. In Venice, we've housed just this year 42 people. In the county, 82, actually up to 120. We have no barriers for those to enter our homes. What's most surprising is that they live in your community in single-family homes. And most of you don't even know that they're there. It is permanent housing. We do have services to support them so that they can re-enter and integrate into communities. And all of them are in recovery. They are mental health consumers. They suffer from trauma in several other areas. Our barriers are funding. If we had proper funding, we could house thousands of people by the end of 2016. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed Rosenthal, not here. Blair Bedston, Wayne Peppa, and Patty Berman.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm Blair Beston, Executive Director of the Historic Core Business Improvement District, and I'm also a resident. I have to speak on behalf of several people who were families with small infants that came today to speak that were not able to wait the nearly 2 hours to do so. I'm really happy that this discussion has turned to housing solutions. I think it's really important instead of focusing on the criminalization or decriminalization of the homeless. But I have to speak for people that are not just big property owners or multi-million-dollar businesses, but the small businesses, people that are scraping by to feed their families, to keep their doors open, and many of them are not. Families like mine who are trying to raise families in downtown, and it's chaos now. I beg you to keep this conversation going in the direction of a state of emergency, because I think it is. Coming up with shelter options, treatment, services, turning the focus of the conversation on mental illness and drug addiction, which is what we're faced with. We need to get the people off the streets sooner than later. People are scared, angry, ashamed, and disappointed that it's gotten this bad and that it's growing worse. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wayne and Patty Berman.
Wow, a whole 1 minute, 2 hours to speak 60 seconds. It's just so gratifying, isn't it? So, upstairs on the 10th floor, two of you guys are due for your 3 o'clock committee meeting. So you don't really have a solution. What is the solution? Doesn't matter how many units of housing you build, more will come. You could build 100,000 units tomorrow, 102,000 will show up the next month. You need jobs, JOBBS, instead of BS. Jobs, sustainable jobs. You're not doing that, you're driving the jobs away with stupid shit like your $15 an hour. So you're gonna have more homeless. So get some jobs, then we can work on the homeless.
Patty Berman, Ruth Sarnoff, John Walsh, Antonia Ramirez.
Well, I'm glad that people are speaking to the crisis nature of homelessness and poverty in Los Angeles, because it definitely is a humanitarian crisis. We have, in the 6 southern counties of the state of California, we have 480,000 empty housing units. That's in Los Angeles, Orange County, Imperial County, San Bernardino, Riverside, and I believe the other is San Diego. We need to see where the housing is. Caltrans has a bunch of housing that they are the landlords for, so does Wells Fargo and maybe the city of Los Angeles. We got a lot of land banking waiting for developers, and we need to cut the chase. Thank you.
Thank you. John Walsh, Antonia Ramirez.
Thank you. What we need to also focus, which has not been mentioned, again, that segment of population that are homeless today are homeless because they are homeless by design. Again, you've got attorneys who fail to protect them. They left them holding the bag. Then you've got the gang stalking. Again, look up a Google search, retired ex-FBI agent Ted Gunderson on gang stalking in YouTube. We are victims, not because we're mentals, not because we're gangbangers, not because we're wetbacks, and not because we're junkies, but we stand on principle. You go from one home to another, from hotel to motel, and my attorney can vouch to that. You go from place to place and you get gang stalked. That means they break into your room, they break into your house, they break into wherever you go, and they rob you, they attack you, they beat you. I said, why am I going to pay that kind of money, $275 at the DoubleTree or Beverly Hilton Hotel? I might as well park my ass on the street, which is where I am. I sleep on Temple between First and Broadway. And so what happens? I sleep there, you still get attacked and beaten, but I'm not paying any money. Thank you.
Steve Clare, Monica Alcaraz, Elizabeth Peterson.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Clare. I'm the Director of Advanced Community Housing. We have family housing, permanent supportive housing, and transitional housing for homeless women and their children. I'm really encouraged by what I'm hearing today from the council. I'm really appreciative of the motions that Councilman Cedillo and Councilman Bonner have introduced. You're beginning for the first time since Mayor Bradley declared a housing crisis in 1988 it seems to me, to really come to grips with this issue, and I'm really appreciative that you are. One thing that wasn't mentioned by the Housing Department I wanted to call to your attention directly was, of all the housing resources, tax credits, home funds, state funding, cap and trade, the City of Los Angeles has not put in a penny of its own general funds into the Housing Trust Fund. except for 1 year, 2013, where they committed $18 million to try to get enough permanent supportive housing to satisfy the Jones settlement and to begin ticketing people for sleeping on the streets. The city has to make its own contribution. You're now talking about a crisis and prioritizing. Please use your general fund money. We probably need $50 million a year in the trust fund from the City of Los Angeles general funds. We'd appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Monica Alcaraz, Elizabeth Peterson.
Hi, this is Monica. I'm with the Highland Park Neighborhood Council, and I just want to make sure that we need winter shelters in Northeast. We have nothing. We don't have services, and I like the decentralization of services. Tell me which services, homeless service providers are in Northeast. We have none. So we really need services out there. Also, we don't do housing first. I do CESs, and I'm the coordinator, and we're not doing we don't do housing first because people have to have their IDs. They have to have their social security cards, and that's the biggest issue for me to help link people to housing is getting them to that next step. But because we have no service real providers in Northeast, we have people from Glendale helping me out, people from North Hollywood and from Hollywood. We just need services in Northeast. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth Peterson, Kevin Michael Key, and Herman.
Good afternoon, council members. Elizabeth Peterson. I'm a small business owner in downtown LA and have been a resident of downtown Los Angeles for many, many years. I've never seen the homeless population and problems that we are having right now. I do feel it's a state of emergency. I also feel that it's very, very important that we look for housing for people that are not just sober, but that people that are recovering. I worked on a case with Councilmember Wisar, and we worked and looked at integration instead of isolation. What we're doing right now is we are isolating market rate from formerly homeless and homeless, and we need integration. I think it's a very, very important fact that we cannot integrate in society without working together, and I think we'd really like to encourage some buildings that are market rate, formerly homeless, and affordable so that we can integrate and work together in a community where we can help each other, because right now we're completely isolating areas and it's creating crime, problems, victims in the homeless departments, and then for us that are living and blessedly able to make a living, we're being isolated in that thing. So I strongly recommend, especially where I know the streets of downtown Los Angeles, that we look at integration and we look at providing services and homes for people that are not completely clean and sober at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin Michael Key, Herman, and Laura Hill.
Good morning, council members. Kevin Michael Key. I'm a Skid Row advocate. I still live, still work, and still got clean and sober in Skid Row, the world's largest recovery community. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to come down to Skid Row Friday, September 25th. We're going to be celebrating Skid Row, the world's largest recovery community. Mr. Cedillo said we need to figure out what we can do. Well, this is the Homelessness and Poverty Committee. I think y'all got a big mandate, and I venture that these issues are going to outlive this committee and each and every one of these committee members. Whose duty is it? It's all of our duty. And what can we do? I don't know, big picture, what we can do. We got to do something. But I'm here today because we need bathrooms. 4 bathrooms were taken out of 2 parks in Skid Row. And I've heard millions of dollars and acuities and all of those things. Somebody needs to step up and be the hero to my community. That's one thing we can do because people got to go. And so it's a public health issue, and we hope that we can get the bathroom replaced and we'll deal with the rest of these matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Herman, Laura Hill.
Other than say what principle that all men at one time were created equal, and by all means that their rights on an everyday basis have not been diminished by the principle of the Constitution to have affordable, sustainable housing, in whatever direction it comes, like a coin, heads or tails. No man should be threatened to live on a street, sidewalk, or street, or in a public park regardless of where he lives. He should not be examined unworthy the way you view us, those of us who are on the streets. Give us dignity. Provide us dignity. The responsibility of constructive communication to provide fucking housing that is appropriate for us all. In other words, that are related to our situation, not be discriminated or isolated. We are a human being, not the future of what you're creating, gentrification.
Laura Hill.
Hi, my name is Laura, and I represent the South Park Business Improvement District. We're a 32-block district located in downtown Los Angeles, which includes LA Live, the Staples Center, the Convention Center, and a fast-growing residential population. The BID is affected by homelessness daily, and it is posing serious health and safety concerns. This issue is not limited to DTLA, of course. It is a citywide crisis that needs immediate attention. The BID understands the importance of prioritizing access to housing. We simply ask that the conversation not be limited to housing. The homeless population in LA need access to other regionalized services, including mental health services and employment opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. That ends public comment for item number 1. Now I will go to people who submitted cards for general public comment for this meeting. Antonia Ramirez, Herman, Alisa Rivera.
Once again, what principle that all men at one time were created equal, and we should not be diminished when our rights are being criminalized as being homeless by federal dollars and state dollars. And by the way, 2 houses on 1 large acre lot in Sylmar, only 42,000 square feet for $620,000, I believe. Great deal, huh? Why don't you take the parking structures that you have on Broadway, Fiesta Broadway, and turn them into some type of housing for the homeless? Get the fucking people off the street, Weezar, and let them be in a home. Nobody wants to share a house. No one has to share a house. We're not from Mexico, brother. Or as you say, cuz, you know, like Herb Wesson, your brother. Get your shit together. We don't want to live together. We want to live in our own home and have the dignity of housing. Thank you, Cedillo.
Antonia Ramirez, Alisa Rivera.
Isn't it obvious that we have a large wetback and Chango gangbanging population, and many of them keep coming in because they have a roadmap to come into and know what services to get before any military veteran or others get it? And again, I ask you, either in low income and or homeless areas, they exist in all neighborhoods. So who is going to house the military veterans first? These wetbacks and gangbangers will always be housed first in all neighborhoods and all communities. Why that has become the general standard, I do not know. But again, I demand that this city first and foremost house our military veterans, provide them with housing, with jobs, and with all opportunities that they deserve first and foremost, and deport all the illegals and get the baby boomers and the senior citizens out of homelessness before we compound the problem. If we don't rectify it right now, we will compound it before December of this year. So again, I say deport, deport, deport.
Alisa Rivera, Alexis Lidquist, Noemi Tagorda.
Hi, my name is Alisa Rivera, and I'm a 7-year resident of downtown Los Angeles and the mother of an 8-year-old boy. I'm also the administrator for the Downtown Los Angeles Parents Group, and I run a website called dtlafamilies.com. And I'm here today because I'm extremely concerned with the deterioration in safety and health on the streets of my community. The impetus for me to come here was what's going on in Pershing Square. We have a beautiful new playground, and we are all welcoming of that playground. But when I took my son there was a stream of people trying to enter the playground, getting into altercations with the guards, swearing. There's open drug use going on. There's people defecating and urinating in the park. And even though we have a beautiful playground, we have no use for it because it's not a safe and healthy environment for children. A healthy community depends on families to keep it healthy. Right now, families are leaving downtown Los Angeles. So we just wanted to make you aware we're there. We're raising our children downtown, or attempting to, and we are being directly impacted by the conditions that are deteriorating daily on our streets, with detrimental impact on the welfare and safety of our children. So we're glad to see that this is being treated as the emergency that it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexis Lindquist, Noemi Tagorda, Monica Alcaraz.
Hi, thank you for your time, council members. In line with Elisa's comment, I am a family 5-year resident of Little Tokyo, and I just want to comment on the frequency and intensity of dangerous incidents that my family encounters on a daily basis now, just bringing my children 1 block and 2 blocks to school on 3rd Street. So we're looking at 3rd and Central and 3rd and Main. I'm witnessing people directly outside of that preschool snorting cocaine. 3 people have taken swings at my head. People shout about my race. People are constantly making comments trying to speak to my daughter when they can't get my attention. The trash, abandoned furniture, and abandoned clothes. There are 1 to 6-year-olds walking that street every day with their kids, and they can touch it and pick it up. So please consider the safety of the kids on that street.
Thank you. Noemi Tagorda? Not here. Monica Alcaraz? Peggy Lee Kennedy? And David Fitzgerald.
So this is just the general comment part. I also want to say that the cleanups are not helping. I understand why the cleanups need to be done because of the hazardous materials, but when we're going out there and we can't find the people because they're being moved from the Arroyo, they're going up to the Southwest Museum, they're at the park, they're just moving around. It's hard for people that are working to try to service them to find them. So it's really, really hard. And when they're being harassed by the park ranger because they're being harassed, it's not a good thing. So I understand why the cleanups need to happen, but when they're being criminalized and they're being just moved around and no real services are being provided, it makes us hard to service them. Thank you.
Thank you. Peggy Lee Kennedy, David Fitzgerald, Wayne Peppa.
Hi, Peggy Lee Kennedy, Venice Justice Committee, 3rd generation resident of Venice. My daughter is 4th, and we have something in Venice called the Venice Family Clinic, and it's huge, and it serves a lot of people for free that are homeless. So there's a sort of a reason people need to be there. So you have to think of that when you try to send people to other places like industrial areas that don't have the Venice Family Clinic. Also, last time I made public comment here, I let you know that in the last year, 2 homeless people have been shot and killed by the LAPD. That was Brendan Glenn and Jason Davis, and now Jason Jamal Warren was shot and killed August 29th. That's just a little while ago. And it was a security guard. He's a homeless man, African-American homeless man. People are dying, and we need to look at what the solutions are instead of demonizing people.
Thank you. David Fitzgerald, Wayne, John Walsh.
Good afternoon. My name is David Fitzgerald. I'm a downtown resident, and I'm the Dean of Students at a brand new high school here in downtown called the American University Preparatory School. We're a 7-day boarding school with students coming from all over the city, county, and state to reside here in downtown. As Dean, I'm responsible for the physical and emotional well-being of the students. I'm deeply concerned with the safety as my students learn and explore the downtown area. We've set stringent boundaries from which the students are permitted to roam, but even then we found this is not enough to shield them from some alarming situations that have already occurred. As our school expands its student body, we must ensure their safety. We urge this council to do whatever they can to reduce crime and poverty within the downtown area. As a school, we are willing to roll up our sleeves and help in any way that we can. Downtown's an incredible place to live, but together we must increase the safety of our students so they can better learn from all that Los Angeles have to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wayne, John Walsh, Ruth Sarnoff.
Yes, once again, LA Times, 2 houses on 1 large acre lot, Sylmar. 42,898 square foot for $620,000. You can be a commercial landlord. Isn't that wonderful? For 2 fucking houses, $620,000. That's who owns everything. Campaign donors, they own you. Who represents the homeless? Nobody. Look at the 101 on both sides, starting with Hollywood and those 3 passes. Homeless on each side of the freeway. Unbelievable. Disgusting. People, veterans, homeless in the richest country on earth, bankrupted by stupid banks and real estate speculators. It fucking stinks.
Ruth Zarnoff, Monica Richardson.
Ruth Sarnoff. I wanted to note that the placing of a lot of new housing in commercial zones often has another element which everyone should be very conscious of should you decide that that's part of the way you want to go, because that's where all the dirty industries have been. And we've had thousands of them in the southeast area of Los Angeles, South LA, East LA, many parts of the city. All of Los Angeles was an oil field long ago. Secondly, I want to urge council people to speak within their own areas and bring together people in a way that they can truly hear each other, those who are housed and those who are homeless, and not with the pattern of the downtown meeting with the, well, you know who, the downtown meeting where everything was controlled and nobody could get a chance to speak because it was a controlled agenda. And I have an article on it in here, and I have some handouts for you. And
thank you.
If I might have just one more second, I really feel that we need garbage collection in the Skid Row and downtown area. If these tents were all houses, you would have trash pickup, and it would be a regular function. There was a big article in the Times about trash pickup and the inequity of it in poor communities.
Thank you. Monica Richardson.
Hi, I'm Monica Richardson, and I'm a long-term resident of Los Angeles, California. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've made a film called The 13th Step, which I would like to invite you all to come see at the Awareness Film Festival that's going to be held downtown at LA Live. The courts have been ordering violent and sex offenders into Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for decades. I follow a murder by Carla Brada, who was murdered by a man who was court-ordered to Alcoholics Anonymous over 50-something times over 20 years. It's not the only murder that's happened around the country. So I would like to begin a conversation and raise awareness about what Alcoholics Anonymous is and what it isn't. When somebody gets a DUI, if you're 20-year-old, you're going to get sent to Alcoholics Anonymous. There are other programs like Moderation Management, Women for Sobriety, Smart Recovery that have been approved by the city of Los Angeles, and that the one judge that I know of court orders anybody there. So it's a religious organization from the 1930s. Again, I'd like to invite you. I'm Monica Richardson. The film is called The 13th Step. Please come and let's begin a conversation about changing the practice that's going on in our courts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That concludes the public comment, general public comment for this meeting. Are there any further questions or comments on item number 1? Did you fill out a card? Oh, I don't have. You could come up and speak, and then we will note you for the record. If you just state your name, please.
I'm a longtime 15-year resident of downtown Los Angeles. I'd like to thank the council members who did show up to this very important meeting, and shame on the council members who couldn't be bothered. I think that if you aren't declaring this a state of emergency, you really aren't cut out to be a council member representing Los Angeles, and you've certainly never been in downtown or Venice. And I think that the whole idea of this ghettoization, the centralization of services in one area is disgusting. and absolutely has to stop. Every single council member needs to take their fair share of responsibility for addressing the Los Angeles County-wide homelessness issue, period. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other further questions or comments on this? Again, this was our opportunity to get presented with some information with respect to housing, as it could lead and inform our staff to develop a strategic plan. With that, I would ask that we ask our staff to provide a further analysis and refinement of the information presented today, given the discussion, which includes a further analysis of the cost needed and possible sources to develop the types of housing needed and what that gap is, to further discuss and present how we will move towards a decentralization of services with respect to housing, to endorse a vision where housing assets are strategically integrated and where short-term housing explicitly leads people into stable or permanent housing, to respond to the shift away from transitional shelter and pursue rapid rehousing and bridge housing with those reprogrammed funds, include shared housing as one of the housing alternatives given the possible cost effectiveness. And as Councilmember Bonin brought up, and he will also present a motion to start winter shelter program early. And I understand you will prepare a motion as well, since that is something that may require action before the strategic plan is completed. Consider what's appropriate for the city to contribute in the area of move-in funds, which we really didn't discuss, but was mentioned briefly by the last presentation. Examine what resources the city should be seeking from the county to ensure the city is getting its fair share. And anything to add to that? I know, Mr. Cedillo, you added some items, some further report backs. If you could repeat those, please. Yes. The microphone, please. Yep.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Let me applaud your leadership. This has been, I think, perhaps one of the most significant meetings on this matter. I think we're beginning to get it right. And I think we're moving towards a consensus. Mr. Bonner and I have chatted with this. Mr. Harris-Dawson is of accord, and I think all of us are, in terms of declaring a state of an emergency. And so we're going to work on a motion that does that declares a state of emergency with respect to housing and the homelessness. And I think the thing we want to do is prioritize housing. And just briefly, the elements so far as part of a broader conversation, areas to look at, would be putting affordability first. In other words, we've got planning and housing, and we've got a queue, right? That people are waiting for their projects. But if we put affordability first, then we put them at the front line, we fast track them, and we begin to move more units towards the impacted population. We should look at CEQA and its impact on this. There's a conversation going on statewide about the abuse of CEQA, and we should make sure that that does not occur in our efforts to build housing for homeless. Clearly, and this was one of the motions in the housing conference we had 2 weeks ago, looking at the city properties, particularly parking lots. Our districts are similar. I know that the parking lots are rare, and city property is rare, not as what people think. But nonetheless, there are some lots and properties that would be appropriate for us to focus for affordable housing, and that should be part of this motion. I think we should look at the zoning and see what properties that we could rezone so that we could build, perhaps might be the location where we do the micro units and other housing. I know that, almost called you Senator, Councilmember Bonin had also mentioned our work, and I've been visited by many faith-based organizations who are offering their properties as places for us to use for shelters during this emergency period. One of the other things we did at the housing conference is spoke about, and we have a separate motion for that, is the fees that are paid, that in many instances fees are demanded up front, but yet the utility of those services are not happening until the back end years later, and we could waive those fees as part of this emergency period. And that we should also look at, because this is an emergency and this is a city problem, that we should look at being able to put affordable housing throughout the city and not just in targeted communities. We should not allow ICOs and other zoning schemes to block affordability citywide, because this is in fact a citywide crisis and a citywide emergency.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Bonin?
You mentioned in your recommendations shared housing. I also think it would be useful for staff to look into interim housing, which is different than transitional housing, has different requirements and outcomes, and it would be something that would be worth prioritizing as well.
Good, thank you. So with that, those directions will give inform our staff as we come back with a report back to fill in our strategic plan. And again, as a reminder, once we hopefully adopt a strategic plan in this committee, that would also include what the costs will be. And when we adopt this, it would be the right time where the budget discussions would have started for the city. So that would be right in line to then discuss how do we align our strategic plan with the budgetary discussions as the council and the mayor of the council pursue those. So we'll give that direction and further discuss this item when it gets a report back. So thank you very much.
Can I ask you to do me a favor?
Our next item, please, item number 2, if you could read that into the record.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Item number 2 is a motion by Council Members Bonin and Wizar relative to the instruction for the CEO to work with the Los Angeles County officials to determine whether the city, as a pilot program in certain neighborhoods with large population of chronically homeless individuals, can access the flexible housing program, and detail what policy changes or resources are needed in order for the city to participate.
Thank you. Mr. Bonin.
Chair, this motion came about as a result of a couple conversations with my partner, Supervisor Kuehl. Shortly after she took office, the first meeting we had, which was either in late December or early January, we were talking about housing models that the county was doing that were successful. And the program they described is this new flexible housing subsidy pool. In order to reduce some of the costs of their healthcare system from folks who were homeless who were frequently using the healthcare system, the county used, I believe, some money from their boomerang funds, their general fund, and put it into this flexible housing subsidy pool. And if you are homeless and you use frequently, a couple times, I believe in a 6-month period, a county urgent care facility, the county will offer you a flexible housing voucher and you get housed rapidly. It doesn't have the same strings attached to it as federal programs because it's county money. Folks in the second conversation I had with Supervisor Kuehl's office came when I was doing a tour with her staff and some county health officials in Venice. And we encountered a gentleman who was unconscious and in distress on 3rd Avenue in Venice. And we called 911. And LAPD responded, and the paramedics and the firefighters described to us that about anywhere between 70 to 80% of the calls that Fire Station 63 gets are generally folks who are homeless and who are in distress and need medical services. And I inquired about why this program was not available in Venice. And it turns out to avail yourself of this program, you have to be using a county urgent care clinic or medical facility. And the closest one to Venice is in Torrance. And no LAFD unit or ambulance is going to respond there. It's too far away. So the point of this motion was to ask CAO and city officials to work with the county to see if there's a way that the city can, at least as a pilot in Venice, perhaps elsewhere, buy into this program, either through financially or some sort of in-kind contribution, buy into this program so that either, in this case, Marina Hospital in the Venice area, or perhaps LAFD paramedics themselves could be a portal into this program, allowing folks who are living on the streets in Venice, chronically homeless, often in need of medical care, to get housing more quickly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonin. We'll go to public comment, and then I would suggest that we refer this motion to staff and integrate it with our strategic plan and report that unless there's and we'll take that action at the end. That'll be the recommendation. But we'll take public comment at this time. Susie Shannon, Ruth Zarnoff, Antonia Ramirez.
Hi, I'm Susie Shannon with Poverty Matters. I just want to speak in support of expanding the flexible housing program. I've been able to sort of witness this program and sort of help get some of our clients through this program, and it is exceptional. One of the issues right now is that the federal HUD programs have too many barriers, and so this provides a separate pool of money where we can get around those and get people housed. It's fantastic. I think the city's only putting in about $200,000 to this program. I think that whether it's a county program or a city program, we all benefit, and it saves us money, and I would love to see this expanded into Venice and South Central Los Angeles and into the Valley. It's the next iteration of Housing First. I think it's the future of where our housing programs are going, and I can't speak more in its praises. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ruth Zarnoff, Antonio Hernandez.
Due to the nature of the rather still budding and growing exponentially housing crisis in our community, I think it would be smart to begin to investigate a way to provide water to the residents of any community there that has enough that this would be able to be used. It's used in third world countries, and we kind of have a third world community problem here right now. And if we had water trucks where tap water could be taken directly and people could fill their bottles up, it would be important. For every 3 bottles of it's 3 bottles of water to make 1 bottle of bottled water. We lose water. We waste water, we have to make plastic and everything that goes with it in packaging. So I urge you to consider that.
Thank you. Antonia Ramirez, Don Davis, Josh Graham.
Thank you. To those of you who think you're going crazy, you're not crazy. If you're homeless like me and you are out there, it's because you've been a whistleblower or you've spoken out, or you stepped on somebody's political toes. You become targeted, a targeted individual, and that means you become gang-stalked. Ever since I started exposing the gangbangers, the wetbacks, and all the junkies, and all the crimes that they contribute and perpetuate in America, I've become a targeted victim. I've been moving so many times. My then attorneys know how many times I've moved in the last several years. It's been draining, it's been tiring, and now I sleep on the streets. Again, this is a matter of principle. I'm not a butt kisser, and nor will I ever be. But I want people to know that we're going to keep fighting gang stalkers, and I'm going to find out who it is behind the gang stalkings against me. Again, to the people, I want to raise awareness. You're not mentals. Stand and believe and fight for what you believe in, because when you go to your grave, you can say, I did it. I did the right thing. Hooyah. God bless Donald Trump.
Don Davis, Josh Graham, Herman.
Josh spoke the last time, and I probably should have spoken up then because it's not really related to item 2, but I was required to put an item down, and I did.
Okay.
So very quickly.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Dawn Davis, and I also live and work in downtown LA. I encourage whatever policy changes and resources are necessary for the city to not only increase our housing stock for our homeless, but also for those who are teetering on the edge of homelessness. The livability of our city continues to disintegrate into the shadows of shiny, new, luxury high-end buildings, while the population of those making their home on the street increases. While a $15 an hour minimum wage by 2020 is a dismal start, we need to get a handle on the crime, the mental illness, and the affordable housing. And not just affordable housing in the traditional sense with supportive services, but housing affordable to teachers, retail, our service workers, because many of these are teetering on the edge of homelessness themselves. We also need to understand why so many of those that are making their home on the streets are either hesitant or resistant to take themselves to services. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for waiting. We apologize. Didn't call you up. It said item 2. Herman, Monica Alcaraz, Ray, Dan Hick or Chick. Herman, not here. Monica Alcaraz, not here. Roy and Wayne.
My name is Roy Danchik. I'm here representing Leo Beck Temple in West Los Angeles. We at Leo Beck are vitally interested in two issues: the global problem of homelessness here in Los Angeles and the local problem of housing, providing housing in our institutions of faith. We at Leo Beck are engaged in a pilot program for selling 3 RV recreational vehicles with well-vetted owners in our on our campus, and we would like to provide them provide this as a template for the many thousands of religious institutions of faith in Los Angeles. And we thank especially Councilman Cedillo and Councilman Bonin for their understanding and their help. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will refer this item to staff and integrate it with our strategic plan presentation. So that leaves, what's our next item?
Mr. Chair.
Okay,
Yes.
that concludes this meeting, and thank you to all the staff who presented today, your hard work, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.